Hello and welcome to our latest VAST customer training webinar. So today is a slightly different, less technical topic in some ways than what we normally cover, but very important. We're going to cover what exactly a VAST admin needs to know. And there's multiple reasons that this is important if you're new to being a VAST admin or you have people who report to you who are VAST admins. It's crucial for them to understand what is involved in being a VAST admin, and it's also crucial for the VAST admin exam, the certified administrator exam that we're going to be releasing very soon. So part of this webinar will be focused on what VAST admins need to know, and then we're going to talk specifically about the VAST certified administrator exam, make sure that you have all the details, whether you're interested in taking that sooner or later. So with that short introduction, I will say we're going to share lots of resources during this. Please use the chat or Q&A to be able to ask your questions. We'll make sure they get answered. I'm going to invite our first guest onto the stage. So Phil Wagstrom, you have been training VAST admins for a very long time and have been diligently involved in this. I'm going to hand it over to you to cover what does a VAST admin need to know.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Morning, afternoon, everybody, or evening, depending on where you are. So once again, I'm Phil Wagstrom with the Office of CTO here at VAST Data. And I'm going to talk about, we're going to go over what kind of the different topic areas that we have that any new VAST admin needs to know. And again, this is leading up into our certification exams that we're going to start offering here. So let me delve into it. This is going to be a little bit different presentation. It's not going to be as deeply technical. I'm just going to go over the different topic areas here. So with that, I'll share out my screen and we'll dive into the presentation here. And here we go. All right. So we're going to talk about the various different areas of expertise for a VAST admin and kind of the different areas that we feel are important for someone new to VAST to go through and expose themselves to the different types of topics and the different types of areas and the types of tasks that you do on a day-to-day basis with administering a VAST cluster. This is not going to be the complete plethora of things that VAST does. This is going to focus mainly on the core areas for day-to-day administration. So we've broken this down into a couple different areas of topics here, and I'm just going to delve into them. And the first one that's important is understanding what the VAST architecture is. What makes the VAST architecture different from others? What is the DAYS architecture, and DAYS being disaggregated, share everything. Understanding the roles of a C node and a D node and what their purposes are, and along with that too, understanding how things like erasure encoding comes into play when we start talking about dealing with handling faults and doing expansions and writing data out. So these kind of concepts are very key, because if you understand the concepts of DAYS, then a lot of the other day-to-day tasks become a lot more simpler conceptually, because you know where the data is coming in, how things are being accessed, the impact of things like expansions and hardware fault, dealing with hardware faults and maintenance and things like that. We're going to want to again talk about the erasure encoding, how we protect our data across the SSDs, how we handle SSD failures. We'll talk about want to understand in general the basic data reduction methods that are available to VAST. This includes things like just your standard compression, it includes your data deduplication, it includes your similarity compression, your similarity deduplication with that. And then talking about a bit about the capacity metrics that we have for these and what these actually mean. So understand the difference between physical space and logical space, use space, free space, auxiliary space, how the metadata usage is calculated, how the data usage is calculated, and what the differences are between those. So the first portion of this is again, like I said, it's going to be basically just the architecture, understanding what a cluster is, what it composes of, what makes it different for that, and along with that, what kind of options you have when it comes to doing things like expansions on that. The next area topic is going to be along VMS. So you have your physical cluster. Now we need to go, how do I as an administrator interface with a cluster, and what are the options with this. For VAST, the management interface is referred to as VMS. VMS is responsible for not only doing the administration, but also doing a whole bunch of other things. It's responsible for collecting metrics and responsible for alert notifications. It is the API interface for everything within the cluster. So we go through, and you need to understand the concept on how you access VMS, what the role and limitations are of using the GUI, using the VCLI, using the REST API interface. Some of the Python SDKs that we have for those. So understanding those options that are available there to interface with VMS, so that you're not looking at just the GUI all the time. You have other tools available. And this again may include, as I said, the Python SDK for scripting. It may include questions about or how do we go through and how do we use VCLI to do things like batch jobs. I want to create a number of shares there. I can put this into a file and then execute that as a batch job via VCLI, or I could do the same operation using the Python SDK or use the VastPy CLI command, which is part of that, to do these types of tasks and automate them in some forms. This includes also performance monitoring, understanding what kind of metrics and what kind of performance monitoring we do within the GUI. And then some basic API access. We're not expecting a new administrator to know exactly how to write complex Python scripts to query the API, but a basic understanding as to where the API is, how it functions, how it operates. It's kind of where the baseline is there. So we want to have some good topics about those, some good understanding for new administrators with those. Moving on to that, part of VMS, a very important part of VMS is RBAC, or role-based access control, or the delegation of responsibility, so that you don't have to have that one admin super user having access to everything. You may have different roles that need to be used by different people. You may have a NOC that only needs to monitor the system, and you don't want to give them the ability to create views and delete views and things like that. So VMS RBAC is a core feature of VMS that we want to be able to have understanding. So that includes things like defining the different roles. Here we have an example of the screenshot of the roles here, along with understanding what the different realms are, or custom realms are for those. Along with that too, we wanted to talk about integrating. How do I integrate with a remote provider, such as Active Directory or LDAP, such that I as an administrator don't have to maintain all those admin passwords locally on the cluster, and we can have all of that come from Active Directory and follow those kind of rules. And tied in with that too, possibly how we go through and configure the cluster to work with single sign-on. With this as well, with just basic RBAC, is when we start talking about multi-tenancy, understanding the difference between a cluster administrator and a tenant administrator, what their realms are, what kind of areas and things that they can do. So basically, again, controlling access for individual managers or individual cluster administrators or tenant administrators, in what areas they have access to work with. We want to be able to make sure administrators have an understanding of how VAST does networking. Networking is very key with configuring anything with VAST. When we start talking about creating tenants and create, exposing views and things like that, we're not so much concerned about individual IP addresses or things there. We configure access to those really based on the VIP pools that are there. So we need to go through and talk about how do I define a VIP pool? What kind of information do I need to have? What are the options? Which C nodes, how can I select what C nodes a VIP pool can run off of, or how many VIP pools can a particular C node support? So those kinds of things there. So it'll be covering those areas. I want to talk about the VAST DNS service. So I've got a VIP pool with a number of addresses. How do I control access? Make it easy for my clients to go through and access that VIP pool, to access the views and the data that are there without having to go through and look up individual IP addresses. So we'll talk about the VAST DNS services, or alternatives for the VAST DNS service, and what the pros and cons on using it is. And then a little bit about layer 3 BGP. When it comes to layer 3 networking, for that, realize that that's not an entirely common situation in every customer customer scenario, but a basic understanding is going to be kind of expected there as to what it is and how it operates and what some of the options are for that. So we'll include a bit of that in there. Want to have an administrator understand, how they can isolate not only data but workload. And this will be, understanding the difference between, hey, if I've got a view, what is able to access that view if a client is, or if that view is on one tenant versus another, how is that data isolated from each other? How do we go through and how do we segment things from, have a client that they're only allowed to see certain views and not others? How do we deal with authentication? How the view policies interact with the VIP pool. So if I create a view policy that has no VIP pools defined, and how is that different than if I define, a view policy that has one VIP pool defined in versus a view policy that has a different VIP pool defined in. So we'll talk, we want to have an understanding of how those operations work. And then when it comes down to some isolation, and even though this is not really isolation, it's more of a control, how QoS policies work for not only users, but also for views. Because we may want to have a particular data set or a particular view that I want to control the amount of bandwidth that view consumes, be it limited to a certain low number, or size it based on the amount of data that's in there. Or when it comes down to things like handling users consuming too much bandwidth, or a workload consuming too much I/O, which is impacting other users or other workloads. How can I go through and restrict that particular workload? So how can I apply a QoS policy to a particular user for those? So understanding those kind of interactions. Along with this, when we're talking about those, we want to also understand, if I'm making configuration changes, what are going to be the impacts of those configuration changes? So with a lot of things within the cluster, you can make changes on the fly. Some of them will have no client impact. I mean, the client can continue to go through and service I/O. Some of them will have a lot of client impact, meaning suddenly a client can't access data because you've taken away a VIP pool that they were accessing. Other ones may see a temporary or very momentary impact. Like if I want to go through and I change a VIP pool to change the C nodes that are on, those VIP addresses have to be redistributed for those. So we need to understand, or the system administrator, VAST administrator needs to understand what kind of changes are can be done in the system and what those impacts are going to be for any particular end user. So this will be things like, as I said, things like, if I make a change to the VIP pool, or if I make a change to the allowed characters or the path link limits. Now, VAST is multi-protocol by nature, which means that the element store itself can store a lot of characters, can store more, is not subject to a lot of the traditional file system levels, but there are protocol limits for those, where certain characters are not allowed in SMB and certain ones aren't allowed in NFS and certain ones aren't allowed in S3. So understanding what the controls that VAST has around those and what the impacts are between either using the lowest common denominator for those limits versus using native protocol limits, what those impacts are going to be for those. Along with that too, this goes into some failure scenarios, but also when I go through and I want to do a VAST software upgrade on a cluster, how is that going to impact clients? What are the expected impacts we're going to see to a client? What is the expected behavior for those? Not only for the software upgrades and dealing with hardware faults, but when it comes to and I want to do a cluster expansion, or I'm going to do a cluster expansion, what do I as an administrator need to plan for? When I add additional C nodes, what is going to happen to the VIP pools? When I add additional D boxes into a cluster, how does that look to the element store and what impact, if any, do I see? Then some of these here are going to be related to very specific operations, such as client IP address ranges when it comes to multi-tenancy, or when we go through again and impact those quality of service policies on a live workload. So we'll want to have a good understanding of those for new administrators. And going on to this too, we want to have an understanding of multi-tenancy. Now, realizing that multi-tenancy may not be used by a lot of, across the entirety of customer base, but it is still a pretty important concept for these. Because with multi-tenancy, this could either be, the cases of a CSP, but you may want to have, two different departments that want to have their own data spaces available that are isolated and maybe control administration for those. So there needs to be an understanding as to how that gets implemented. And when we start doing that, there's some other ancillary topics that we need to understand in terms of how the VIP pool assignments work, how things like the providers work, how the views and view policy works, and then again, how the data isolation works for those, because data in one tenant is not available to data as data in another tenant. They are completely isolated from each other. So we need to make sure that new administrators understand the differences here for those. And then again, as part of the VMS topics, how you administer a tenant, be it I am administering a tenant as a cluster administrator and what I'm able to go through and do, or I'm administering a tenant as a tenant administrator, what type of operations am I allowed to go through and do and perform? So very, very important topics to understand. With this here, I want to have a basic understanding of protocol audit. So very with VAST, we are able to audit all of the protocols that we have. So we need to, as a system administrator, needs to understand what those options are for auditing those protocols. What the differences are between the JSON files that are generated from auditing versus the VAST database, the VAST audit database that gets configured. So what the differences and advantages of each of those are, how we configure those audit policies, how we set a global baseline for those policies. So I can set on a cluster that I want to have this protocol audited regardless of the share, regardless of the view that's out there. I always want to have, let's say, NFS audited. I want to capture at least this data. But you may also want to go through and say, hey, for this critical data store, I need to audit all of the operations that happen on that data store. So as an administrator, you need to know where one of those is set versus another. In the case of auditing, some of it is set in the settings on the cluster because that sets your baseline. Some of those there, if you want to do more auditing on particular data stores, is set in the individual view policy. And then we're going to do some basic audit database querying to get that information. And we're not expecting you to have a complete Trino cluster set up to do some of the fancy things to do detailed reports off it. We're not asking about that kind of setup, but I want to know, hey, I want to find out who moved my file, what information, what types of operations am I looking for, and how would I put those queries into VMS to find find the record that says, hey, this user moved this file or this file got deleted or things like that. So basic understanding. Have some basic performance analytics. So understanding what the performance analytics are that VAST has, where we keep those, how long we keep that data on a cluster, how you can make use of some of those predefined and common analytics to identify problems. This would include things like, how do I use data flow? How do I look at the top users for those. So get all of those there. And then, exporting some basic, creating custom analytics for looking at custom data for this. So maybe I want to look at particular users and views, how to generate a custom analytic to give us that information, and then exporting those out via Prometheus. So how do we get the data off the cluster? How do we get those metrics off the cluster to some kind of external consumer? For those, and what the mechanisms are to not directly, how do I import this into a specific analytic tool or something like that. Just what are the mechanisms that we have to export these off of the cluster and share these out. Understanding the alarms, events, alerts, and alarms on a cluster. So how do I configure and view the alerts that are generated on a cluster? When we have a fault, what gets generated? Where do those get generated? How do I integrate those notices on there with external with external alerting. So this includes things like how do I configure SMTP, how do I configure syslog, how do I configure the webhook alerting, how do I create and modify these custom webhooks for those. So basic setup and operation of those, where those are located. Part of this too is, if I have these alarms that are going off, what if I'm doing hardware maintenance? What if I want to turn off these alarms temporarily? How do we go through and how do we do that? And then some basic, how do I do a mass export of all the alarms for events for doing things like, hey, I want to record this someplace else, or I want to generate a report based on the alarms that have been generated on the system. So how do we go through and do that? General hardware maintenance. So again, we're not expecting a system administrator or a VAST admin to know what the complete process is for going through and physically removing and uncabling a C node, or physically removing and bringing in a new D box or things like that. We're referring to, from an administrator standpoint, from a software standpoint, what kind of activities would an administrator need to know? We need to know, okay, I want to activate or deactivate a C node. What is the process? What is the expected outcome of doing that? What is the potential impact to clients of doing those types of operations? Along with that too, what's the expected behavior if, let's say, I lost a particular SSD on a D box, or I lost a D node on a D box, or I lost one of the switches internally. What is the expected behavior with those? And then with that too, some preparation for those. So if I'm going through and I need to replace a C node on there, I need to get the cluster ready to replace a C node, or do some proactive maintenance on a particular device. How do I look at the cluster to ensure that when I remove that device, that I'm not going to run into, or I'm not going to have some other issue that'll pop up? Do I already have enough redundancy in the cluster? Meaning I've got some C node, another C node in the same that's available to go through and move those VIPs over when I take this C node down. And then go through and be able to identify and interpret some basic hardware alerts, and what those mean, and whether these are critical, where it has to be, whether there's action that needs to be done immediately, or whether it's an alert saying, yes, I had a hardware fault here, it's been corrected, that hardware needs to be replaced, but it's not a system down Sev 1 type issue. For this too, on the software side, basic software maintenance. Understanding when we go through and we do a software upgrade, we do a VAST OS upgrade, what is contained within those packages? What are those options? Where do I get firmware updates for the components there? Where do I get BMC updates for the C nodes or for the D nodes? When do I have to do a Linux OS upgrade versus a VAST OS upgrade? What the differences are between those? And then go through and initiate and monitor a non-disruptive upgrade. So what happens during a non-disruptive upgrade? Where will I see the logs? How do I get those upgrade packages? Where do I obtain those upgrade packages? And how do I stage them on the cluster? And what the expected outcome is for those. And then finally, for the last one, what information, how to use an administrator escalate to VAST support. So this is the final topic here for this. But what kind of data is VAST support looking for? When you have an issue, or when you encounter an issue, whether this be a hardware issue, a software issue, a client is having access difficulties, what data can you look at beforehand to kind of isolate that problem? But when it is something that you're unable to resolve yourself, what data is VAST support looking for in terms of that? What kind of a window we want for this? What kind of data in terms of timestamp, in terms of client OS users there? What kind of information to provide that, to write a good support ticket or support request for that? And then from a cluster, when you generate a bundle, what data do we want to have in that bundle? What is the difference between the presets? What is what information we go through and put in there for those? So in general, that is the kind of the overview of the types of topics that we're looking for a new VAST administrator to be fluent with for those, and that's what we're working with to ensure that you have the information for when it comes to attending the webinars and the training sessions that we do, but also for the VAST certification exams that are coming.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. If there are any questions, feel free to add those in the chat. Our Q&A session at the end, Phil will also be available if you have any specific things that he covered that you want a little more information on. So with that, we're going to start our next part of the webinar, which is really about the VAST certification exam. And so I'm going to invite our next guest onto the stage, Esper Chawah. So Esper, you are over VAST certification, and I would love you to just explain to everyone on the call a little more about the exam process and the exam logistics and all of that. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Kristen. Hi, everyone. I'm Esper Chawah. I am the director of the services team on Kristen's team, and I want to transition now from Phil's session on all those important topics that an administrator needs to know and how those are tested on the exam itself. So we're really excited to launch our very first exam under our new Vastronaut certification program. We had something called Vastronaut certification in the past. This is totally different. This is an industry equivalent certification exam. So if anyone has ever taken an exam from Cisco, from Microsoft, Google's high stakes exams, that's what this exam is really about. It's a rigorous, meaningful exam. And I want to share with you first how this exam is built. This is not me sitting down some afternoon and trying to come up with random questions out of our exam guide or out of our administrator's guide or out of our training. The process that we go through is quite a rigorous process to ensure that the exam tests those topics that are important for a VAST administrator to be successful in their role. Basically, all those topics that Phil just went through. So we start our process with a job task analysis. So we identify the role that we want to certify. In this case, it's an administrator, and ask subject matter experts, what does a VAST administrator do on the job? So we list those tasks, and then we send out a survey with those tasks listed to prioritize those tasks. What we want to do on the final exam is ask more questions about the important topics and fewer questions about the less important topics. And the way we determine that importance or priority is through this blueprint surveys that goes out to subject matter experts and also includes members of the audience that we want to certify. Only then do we actually get to the point where we start writing exam questions or exam items, as us certification geeks call them. Again, this isn't me sitting down making up questions out of my head. You do not want an exam created by me. Rather, we work with a group of subject matter experts that know the VAST platform inside and out. And we use the blueprint survey that we did in the previous step to tell us exactly what types of questions to ask on which topics. And an important next step is to test the test. We launched the exam as a beta exam. This exam still counts towards certification. We make this exam available early and at a discount. I'll talk more about that in just a second. But the purpose of this is twofold. Number one is to get the exam out there as soon as possible so that we can get some early adopters getting certified and being part of the first cohort of certified candidates for each of our exams. Again, I do want to emphasize that even though we label this as a beta exam, it does count towards your credential. So if you pass a beta exam, you are still certified. And only after we have that data from the beta exam do we publish the final version of the exam. And the reason we go through this process to make sure it's psychometrically sound is to ensure that it holds up the validity, reliability, and fairness. And what we mean by that is validity is ensuring that any inferences made from the exam results. So if somebody passes, we're inferring that they have some level of competency that they can perform a job task. So we want to make sure that those inferences made from the exam are valid. We want to make sure the exam is consistent and reliable. That's what reliability is all about. So if we have a group of people who have very similar skills and knowledge, they should get very similar pass-fail results from the exam. And we want to make sure that the exam is fair and is only targeting those tasks that are actually required by the VAS administrator to perform their job task. So how do you get ready? How do you prep yourself to attempt a Vastronaut certification exam, and in this case, the Vastronaut Certified Administrator exam? First and foremost, I do want to highlight that it does require some on-the-job experience. It is very difficult to go from zero to hero, so to speak, just through reading materials or just through attending webinars or just through reading exam guides. There are some topics that you can only really master with on-the-job experience. So the approximate recommendation we make is at least somewhere around 6 months of real-world on-the-job experience, so you have exposure to a real vast cluster. Then you can go on to the training and resources. So the VAS Certified Administrator Exam Guide will lay out for you exactly what topics are going to be on the exam and how much of the exam is dedicated to each one of those topics. When you sit down to a Vastronaut certification exam, there should be no surprises. We tell you up front what topics are going to be included on the exam. And there was a question earlier asking about will there be a exam blueprint? I think that's what the question was asking about, was what we call this admin exam guide. So yes, to answer that question, there is a blueprint or an exam guide made available, and we will share that with you afterwards. Additional resources that will help you prep for this exam. We just recently launched a brand new learning portal, our Vastronaut University learning platform, and in there are several courses and resources that cover the topics on this exam. Additionally, you should go through the exam guide and brush up on any topics that you're not quite so sharp on, and use things like the administrator guide or the VAST white paper to look up those topics that you may not have been exposed to or may not have a very high level of confidence to attempt the exam and want to brush up on those topics. So you got yourself all ready. You're feeling pretty good. You're feeling confident. You want to attempt the exam. Where and when is the exam available? Well, I do want to share that the exam will go live first at our user conference at the end of the month in Salt Lake City. This will be the first time that anyone can attempt a Vastronaut certification exam, and there are 2 sessions during the conference that apply to this. So number 1, Phil will do a 4.5-hour not deep dive, but a refresher boot camp to go over some of these topics in a little more detail than he did this morning, to make sure that you're ready to go and attempt the exam with a high level of confidence. And then the exam itself will be made available during a session on Thursday, where you can attempt this exam and be one of the first certified VAS administrators. Now, if you can't make it to the conference afterwards, somewhere in the April timeframe, our new certification platform will be up and ready to deliver this exam online and proctored. So to attempt this exam, you need to make sure that you're in a quiet, isolated environment. This is simulating a test center experience. If any of you have ever done a certification exam at a live test center where you go in, leave your materials at the front desk, show your ID, sit down at a computer. Sometimes there's an audio video monitor. Sometimes there's an actual proctor in the room keeping an eye on things. What we're trying to do is simulate that test center experience online. So this will be made available, like I say, afterwards. The retail price or the sticker price of all these exams is $300. For the conference that I mentioned earlier, it's included in the conference registration fee. So that's part of the discount in attempting this early exam. And I want to go back and re-emphasize and talk a little bit about beta exams, because sometimes this beta label scares people away. And I do want to make sure you understand that it does count towards earning your certification or earning your credential. Some of the things that are slightly different about beta exams, they're a little bit longer. Oftentimes they're made available at a slight discount. And it's a way for you to get early access to these exams and be one of the first certified. So with all that being said, please share any questions that you might have, and we'll be happy to answer those. And Kristen, if there are any questions that you've seen, do you want to share those? And I'll give an attempt or pass them over to Phil.
Okay, I think we're mostly set on questions, but feel free for anyone to hop in. Okay, let's see. Oh, we got a few people who've had trouble getting into VAST University. So do want to clarify a few things. In order to try to bypass the fact that you might have to wait a certain amount of time for like approval, we did add a lot of VAST admins that we knew of to the portal already. So you're going to click that manage password button to be able to set a password and get in. And I know that seems odd in the sense that you would feel like the platform is new to you, but that is the way that we've set it up to, again, try to make that easier on you. So if you run into any difficulty, I did put the university@vastdata.com email in there, and we will respond to that as quickly as we can. We launched this new platform this week, so we're very excited to see so many of you jumping in already and learning. Let's see, we do have a question here. How can a person prepare for the exam who's keen to get into the VAST without VAST experience? So I think that, yeah, Esper, Phil, I'd love for you guys to fill out a little more detail on this one.
Yeah. So first of all, I'll be honest with you, it'll be very difficult to pass without any real world hands-on experience. That's the bar that's set for what we call the minimally qualified candidate. This candidate does have some hands-on experience. It won't be impossible, but like I say, it'll be difficult. What I would recommend, if you don't have access to a live VAST cluster, take a look at our Cosmos community. We do have some hands-on labs available there where you can follow a lab guide and perform some hands-on tasks. So that would be one way that you might be able to get some hands-on experience.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I agree with Esper here. I mean, for these exams here, the expectation is that you do have some hands-on experience. I mean, it's like anything. If you're trying to learn how to drive a car or operate a car, it's hard to pass your driver's license, get your driver's license if you haven't driven a car before. So it can be done, but it's a little bit more difficult. So we do have various different these recordings of the webinars here. We go over a bunch of the different topics. The Cosmos Labs, as Esper points out here, are another great example to get some a bit of hands-on experience with those. But without actually having access to cluster, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do that. That's admittedly true.
Alrighty, and I did just put in the chat the link to Phil's deck that covers admin areas of expertise, and then also Esper's deck, which really outlines the exam and some of the logistics. Okay, it looks like Brett also is having difficulty accessing Vast University. So I will definitely add you to that and make a note of everyone involved. I would say if you try that manage password link, should work, but we will make sure to get that figured out. Okay, Chris Stone as well. Okay, so we will reach out to you individually and also provide more details on that follow-up email to this webinar where we share the recording so that if anyone gets stuck again, you have all that information. Let's see, another question here. Does Vast University provide labs to practice with any courses if you enroll? So yes, there are labs that are part of the courses, and then there's also just labs available for access on our resources page of our website. So I'll go ahead and put those in the chat. Sorry, it's a long link, but those are for our hands-on labs that relate to specific areas. So we've got like an overview of the GUI. We've also got one on networking, user management, analytics, and performance. Let's see, will there be any VM builds of VAST to get hands-on experience in the event? My company does not have VAST deployed yet. So we will have the read-only hands-on labs, the read-only lab that you can access with the guides will be available. And that is what we'll use for people to interact with during the boot camp. Anything to add there, Esper and Phil, as far as that goes?
That's really it. The VAST is such a large program or platform that it's tough to zip it up into a virtual machine or anything like that. So, like Christian was saying, the best place to go is those read-only labs, the Cosmos labs.
Sounds good. And then future aspirations for VAST 4 demo or virtual clusters. Yes, we have a whole demo team that works on options that are available. And so it will continue to evolve for sure. But for right now, this is what we work with. Do we need to bring a laptop? Esper, do you want to go into that? I think you covered it a little, but maybe we'll go over it again.
Yeah. So let me answer it two ways. Number one, if you're asking about bringing a laptop to the user conference at the end of February to do to attempt the exam there, no, you do not. We will have testing stations set up and ready to go for you to use. If you're talking about afterwards, you do need access to a computer, Mac or PC. And Linux is a little bit tricky right now, so I highly recommend getting access to a Mac or PC with a webcam so that we can enable that online proctoring feature. So hopefully that answers your question.
And I will just add too, because that was all specific to the exam, for the boot camp training refresher, that one would be good for you to bring a laptop to because you'll be able to click into those hands-on lab guides and stuff during the presentation.
Yeah, definitely recommend to have that. By far not a requirement to have a laptop during the boot camp refresher sessions that I'm conducting there, but it does help if you want to look at a cluster while I'm going through the slides to be able to go through and do that.
Okay, and I am going to put in the chat the link to our webinar recordings. So this is like where this one will be posted. We'll send it to you by email, but if you want to go back and watch any webinar recordings, you can. Are there any openings for the certification exam at Fast Forward? So like Esper said, we haven't opened up the seats yet. So if you've requested interest, if you've indicated interest in the exam, you will get an email first that will notify you to go in and grab your spot. And we expect that to be in the next week. And let's see, is beta exam listed as a session on the conference agenda? Yes. So that would be the certification exam on the agenda. Anything to add there, guys?
Nailed it.
Alrighty. I think we've answered all the questions. If you have any more, though, you're welcome to email us as well. We will be sending out an email after this, and also for those of you who are taking the exam or working to reserve a spot, then you will get some more instructions too, covering some of those logistics. All right, David said, if you don't get a spot to write, will we be eligible for a free proctored exam? So we will work with the people who don't get a seat. We will have a wait list. So I think Esper mentioned that, but we will have the seats that get filled, and then we'll have a wait list, and we'll work with all those people as far as the wait list and next options. We know just like a Taylor Swift concert, where if you don't get your ticket, they try and do right by you. We want to make that true for the admin certification exam as well. All righty. Well, thank you guys so much. I think we are going to conclude our webinar. So we really appreciate you all jumping on, and we look forward to continuing to see you. We'll have another webinar next month, of course. And if you're coming to Fast Forward, we will see you there. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.